Okay, good afternoon, everybody from the UK. It's a sunny November day here in Oxford, and we are welcoming you all to our weekly CGHE webinar. Today, it's a great pleasure for me. I'm David Mills, I'm Director, to be welcoming the European Association for International Education to talk to us about their barometer. And it's lovely to have two presenters, Laura Rumbley and Jody Hoekstra-Selten, who have been working on this barometer for a while, and they're going to be telling us about the health and vitality of internationalisation within the European higher education area. As always, I suggest you keep yourself muted, and after they've spoken for half an hour or so, please do unmute or use the chat function. Actually, even the question and answer function might be easier to ask questions, and I'll ask you to come forward. It's great. I'm really excited about this, Jody and Laura, because I think this question around how one sort of monitors internationalisation and understands its priorities for national actors is really important. So looking forward very much to hearing about your barometer. The screen is all yours. Welcome.
Thank you so much, David. We are delighted to be with you. Such a pleasure and an honor to be with CGHE and this community. We are indeed here today to talk about the EAIE Barometer, and I hope that you can see an image on the screen with an indication of that topic. I am indeed Laura Rumbley. I'm the Director for Knowledge Development and Research at the EAIE, and I'm joined in this presentation by Jody Hoekstra-Selten, who is our Knowledge Development Officer. We have a lot to share with you, probably too much for a 30-minute slot, but we'll do our best to try to work through it smoothly and clearly, and are really interested in your reactions. We will also say a bit of an apology in advance. There may be a data point you're keen to know about that we might not be able to get our actual hands on in the moment, but if you do have a question that we're not able to answer, we'd be delighted to hear from you after the fact and try to follow up with any answers that we can provide. But in the time that we do have together, as you can see on the screen here, we have a 6-part agenda, which is essentially to introduce you to the EAIE, the barometer, of course, spend the bulk of our time on some key findings that we think might be interesting food for thought, and some indications of some additional work that we're doing with this very large, or for us anyway, rather large data set. And of course, your questions and comments are hugely welcome. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the EAIE, that mouthful of vowels, the European Association for International Education is about 35 years old. We are based in Amsterdam, but are very much a pan-European association. Every year we have about 3,500 card-carrying members. These are not institutions, but rather actual individuals who work in the field of international higher education, largely in a professional capacity, but there may be, and increasingly we see individuals with more of an academic profile or a mixed hybrid kind of working profile. But we are also quite well known for an annual conference every September that in recent years has been drawing 6,500 or more attendees from across Europe and beyond. And really, again, the focus of our work is internationalization in higher education. At the moment, some of the key ways that we define that can be seen in our list of thematic committees. So 9 thematic committees sort of provide the shape of how we see the field of international higher education today. We have individuals working in everything from teaching, learning, and curriculum to marketing and admissions, to questions of social responsibility in the context of internationalization, research in the field, etc. So our interests span quite a wide range of areas, which makes it, of course, very exciting and dynamic. And also to say that beyond our annual conference, we do a lot of other kinds of activities, publishing a magazine, a blog series, a podcast series. We offer trainings in the field, etc. So there's a lot going on at the EAIE, to be sure. One last thing to mention is an indication of kind of what the sort of the starting point for our work in the field really can be seen here in the context of our strategy. A vision for international education really serving a broader purpose in society. And the work that we do is really highly focused these days on the 3 colorful puzzle pieces that you see in the center of our strategy figure here. We're, of course, keen to enable the sector, so to help the individuals who are our members and the broader community do their best work in the field of international education. But we're also increasingly concerned about how we can demonstrate the impact of this work, and then also take information about that impact and begin to influence and engage policymakers, decision makers, et cetera. So hopefully this gives you a bit of a sense of who we are and where we come from as the EAIE. The Barometer is a signature research project, and I say that with a bit of a little r to it. We're not a research organization, but we deeply understand the importance of data in helping us understand our own field, and as I say, tell the story of internationalization to a wider audience. So the Barometer is a research exercise that was first undertaken about 10 years ago in 2015. It consists of a rather extensive survey that we put out to our community and ask them to give us information about how they are experiencing the work of internationalization today. What do they think about their own roles? What do they think about what their institutions are doing? How do they see different kinds of influences from different stakeholders, pressures, opportunities, that type of thing? In 2024, we introduced the third iteration of the Barometer. And while over the last decade, over the 3 different versions of the survey that have been undertaken in 2015, 2018, and 2024, we have endeavored to have a certain number of questions carried over from survey to survey to have a bit of a longitudinal picture. We also recognize that it's very important to attend to the issues and the matters of the day. And so our survey has adjusted slightly over time to kind of respond to the moment. The third edition in 2024 really concentrated on the 5 main areas that you see on the screen here. We put questions to our respondents around how they thought about their own professional roles in the field, questions having to do with whether what they thought about their institutional organization structure and strategy. We had a section on budgets, which we put to individuals who told us they had budget responsibilities. We also introduced for the first time a specific section on the impact of internationalization, which we're going to be telling you a little bit about. And then we also asked for some input from respondents around certain topics of interest in the field today, some hot topics, what they're seeing and what they're thinking about their institutions' engagement in those areas. At a very high level, we want to let you know that we had just under 3,000 usable responses from across 46 of the 49 European higher education area countries. A broad mix regionally and also in terms of profile of institution, types of roles that respondents held, different levels of experience in the field. Much of the responses came from individuals working in the public sector, which makes a lot of sense in the context of Europe, we feel, many working at research universities. And we introduced for the first time a question around whether or not respondents feel that they belong to an underrepresented group or not. Jody is going to say a couple of words about that when she tells us about more in depth about our respondents. But this gives you a bit of a basic indication of who answered our survey, what they bring to the table. And from that, we have quite a number of key details to share with you. So I'm going to pass it along to Jody now with some indications of our respondents.
Thanks, Laura, and thanks to everyone for being here with us today. So as you can see on the screen here, we've been quite lucky in the number of respondents that we've had for the Barometer over the past few years. So for our first edition in 2015, we received 2,400 responses from 32 countries. It's good to mention here that this included anyone working within the field of international higher education. So those linked to institutions, but also those, for example, working for national agencies or any type of organization or association within the field. And we covered European countries at that stage. For the 2018 edition, we then decided to open it up to the European higher education area, so covering more countries, but we did decide to kind of stick to only professionals working at higher education institutions. That is why there was a bit of a drop in the total number of responses, even though we did increase the number of countries. And in this latest edition then, we've once again opened it up to anyone working within internationalization and staying within the EHEA. So we managed to get 2,817 responses from 46 countries in total, which we are, of course, very happy with. And a big thank you to anyone in the audience who filled out the survey. So some country facts then, for example, we've seen a nice increase in the responses from Armenia. They were not allowed to participate in the first edition of the barometer. They did in the second one with 2 responses, but that has very nicely increased to 88 this time around. And we've seen a relatively same trajectory for the Ukraine, with 13 responses for the first edition, slightly higher in 2018, but a big increase to 142 in total for this latest edition. Obviously, we've also seen some decreases. Some examples there are Kazakhstan and Estonia, as you can see on the screen here. So for Kazakhstan, we had a really nice number of responses in 2018, but that dropped significantly for the most recent edition. And Estonia, hanging around 50 responses for both the first and the second edition of the barometer, but a lot lower for this most recent edition, only 17 responses. So some interesting variations that we can see there over time as well. And the top 3 responding countries for this particular survey were the Netherlands, Germany, and the UK. So that is where we got the largest numbers of responses from. If we then look at the profile of all respondents, we can indeed say that they cover all levels of experience within the field. So we have people in there who've just started out within internationalization, but also those that have been there for over 15 years or more. As Laura already indicated, we have 17% that somehow identify themselves as belonging to an underrepresented group. First time we've asked this question, and one that we hope to continue over time in future editions. We have respondents with varying periods of experience within their current role. So also, once again, those that have just started within their role, but also those that have been there for a longer period of time. And we also represent different roles. So we received responses from, for example, vice chancellors, heads of international offices, but also Erasmus Plus coordinators, faculty members. So really a wide variety from different roles across the field. However, when we look at the focus areas that the respondents tend to work in, we do see that the majority is linked to either student and staff mobility, partnerships, or European funded programs. And the majority, over 75%, works at a public institution, and that's then mainly a higher education institution, either a research university or a university of applied sciences. So let's dive into the first set of data then, and that really focuses on respondents and how they feel about their own roles. So as we can see here on the screen, we asked respondents to indicate satisfaction levels linked to how they feel about particular aspects of their work. So the blue and the red bars, the bars on the left for each of the different sections, show that people are satisfied or very satisfied with a particular aspect of their work. Overall, here we can see high levels of satisfaction across the EHEA, especially when we look at overall jobs and the sense of purpose that people get from their jobs. We see lower levels of satisfaction, especially compared to salary and compensation, and work-life balance, and feeling valued by the employer. Looking at country context, we especially see that salary compensation is one where we relatively often see very high levels of unsatisfaction linked to work-life balance as well. But overall, quite a relative positive picture when we look at these particular aspects. We also asked whether respondents still see themselves working in the field within the next 3 years or working at their same institution or organization. We can once again see relatively high levels of agreement here, which shows some type of continuity within the international higher education sector. A bit more agreement when it comes to staying within the sector than it is when staying at their institution. But this is also something where we've seen some very interesting country differences as well, including countries where actually respondents were more likely to stay at their institution than they were in the field. So some interesting variations there, definitely. We also asked how people's roles have changed over the past 3 years. I think we're all aware that a lot has happened in the world, and that is also visible in the data that we collected. So only 19% of our respondents indicated that they have not seen any change in their roles. So that means that a large majority has seen some type of change. And that is either 30% indicating their role now requires more time or effort, 14% indicating their role requires new or different skills, but a majority here, 37%, indicating their role requires both new or different skills and more time or effort. So definitely a lot of change there. Linked to change is usually also a need for training or professional development. So we included a few questions on that. And as you can see here in the graph, we asked a question whether respondents see clear career development opportunities at their institution or organization. And the responses here are quite a mixed bag, really. So we see that 30% actually agrees with this statement that this is offered by their institution or organization, but 40% actually disagrees or strongly disagrees, with almost 30% neither agreeing nor disagreeing, so not being entirely sure about this. So while we see some agreement, we also see definitely some high levels of disagreement with these career development opportunities being offered at institutions. We also then asked whether respondents see a need for training or professional development opportunities. Only 2% indicated they do not have a need. So 98%, a very convincing majority, indicated they either have a significant need, a moderate need, or a limited need for training. And we also saw some very nice regional and country differences here, with, for example, more countries in Northern and Western Europe indicating a limited need, while in Eastern and Southern Europe we had more significant need, moderate need for training. Then looking at satisfaction with the opportunities that are offered by institutions or organizations, we see 58% of satisfaction there, but at the same time, let's not forget that there is indeed 36% of respondents who is unsatisfied or very unsatisfied with the training or professional development opportunities being offered to them. So while a majority indicates satisfaction, those high levels of dissatisfaction are something to definitely take into account as well. All right, I think this is me handing back over to Laura to tell you a bit more about our next section, which focuses on respondents and their institutions.
Thank you so much, Jody. And indeed, as I mentioned, after we asked individuals to give us a bit of an indication of their own roles and how they're experiencing those realities, we moved them into a series of questions that tried to get at how they're thinking about and seeing things developing at their own institutions. So we have here a question that we have carried through the various iterations of the barometer around how responsibility for internationalization is organized or structured at the respondents' institutions. So what you can see here is that there is really a mixed picture, although about 50% telling us that a combination of central and decentral teams is the most common response from our respondents. About a quarter also indicating that a single central team is the order of the day there, and then some different kinds of variations of multiple central teams, decentral teams, etc. What caught our attention with this question has to do with how the responses to it have evolved over time. We've had a very similar type of question for the last several, all three iterations of the barometer. And as you can see on the left, on the right-hand side of the screen, the reliance on a single central office or a single centralized team really has been dropping notably over the last decade, a little over half in 2015, telling us that that was the preferred structure, whereas now we're down to about a quarter giving that sort of response. So I think it's an interesting way to think about how internationalizations or how approaches to internationalization at the institutional level are evolving. And as many people have indicated over time, a sense of mainstreaming or shared responsibility in different ways. We also wanted to know not only how internationalization is structured, but how satisfied respondents are with the structures that they see. And as you can see here, we have almost 60% telling us that they are either very satisfied or satisfied with the way that things are structured or organized. And as with a number of the different findings of the barometer, you can take a bit of a glass half full or glass half empty approach to what you see here. That is notable and not insignificant. But of course, we have another 34% of respondents who indicate they're either unsatisfied or very unsatisfied. And we think, again, being able to feed information from the front lines of experience up through the channels of policymakers and decision makers can be interesting when it comes to this type of question. We also think the question that has to do with confidence in leadership is quite important for us to be aware of and to share with the powers that be. And here we see a stronger sense of confidence or satisfaction with the way things are operating. So about 63% of respondents saying they're either very confident or confident in the leadership for internationalization at their institution, and a slightly less alarming 31% saying that they are not feeling significant levels of confidence in leadership. We are also, of course, curious to know if institutions have a formal policy or strategy or plan. And here we have, almost a perfectly balanced picture here of different ways that policies or strategies or plans may exist, if they exist. About a quarter indicating that internationalization is really quite embedded, highly integrated, we might say, in the overall institutional strategy. Others, almost a third, saying it's an explicit section of the institutional strategy, and a quarter saying that it's a standalone document. So we continue to see a variation of the ways in which policies or strategies or plans are positioned within institutions, but a significant proportion having them across the landscape. We, of course, are also interested in understanding whether or not respondents see that their institutions have a clearly defined set of goals for internationalization. And here we have, again, over 50% strongly agreeing that yes, their institutions have this clear set of goals, a quarter not being terribly in agreement with that statement, but not necessarily indicating that that isn't the case. But of course, whether or not one has goals, it's interesting when they do exist to get a sense of whether respondents think those goals are achievable. And here I think it's quite interesting to see nearly 80% of those who say that there is a clearly defined set of goals feel that those goals are achievable. So I think some level of confidence in what's going on there is notable. When it comes to what's driving the establishment of a clearly defined set of goals, we wanted to understand, what are some of the prominent elements there. And as you can see on the screen here, really the existence of a clear strategy, the role of leadership, the position of administrative staff and academic staff all seem to play a role in the ways that respondents feel that these clearly defined set of goals have been made possible. I think what's more interesting on this graph is to look at the bottom end of it and to note the relatively small percentages of respondents that noted that a conducive national environment makes this possible, or that students are standing out as drivers in the work to establish clear goals for internationalization. And I think in a context in which there's been a lot of conversation about student voice, student experience, it's interesting, I think, to note this particular finding. And of course, it raises more questions than it answers as far as we're concerned. The influence of drivers, so we understand that people see that there are certain drivers that are playing a role, but to what extent are they playing that role? What's important in, what's influential in the institution's internationalization goals? And here you can see that the executive board and team and the academic staff really have there's the standouts here as being the top two most visibly seen by our respondents as being either highly influential or influential. We also see that national authorities and European level authorities at the bottom of the screen are also actors of note according to our respondents. And again, much less influence seen in the roles that students, former and current, play, and external advisory boards, which is somewhat notable as well. In order to get a clear picture of what's happening with internationalization, we also wanted to understand the levels of attention that respondents feel need to be applied by their institutions in order for those institutions to achieve their internationalization goals. So we presented them with a list, a rather extensive list of all the different things that institutions might be doing at the moment to advance internationalization, and for them to indicate for every one of these activities, do you think your institution needs to apply more attention in the next several years, continued levels of attention, less attention, what might be? And here we found that almost everything on this list appeared to require more attention or continued levels of attention, according to our respondents. And indeed, the average of more plus continued attention was 89% across all of these different topical areas. From our perspective, that tells a very interesting story about the very multidimensional nature of internationalization, that our respondents really do see it as involving many different kinds of activities and priorities. And in many ways, that's a very exciting finding. It can also be a sobering finding for those who have the responsibility for shepherding these processes forward at institutional level. What are the priorities? What are the funding requirements of all these different kinds of activities? And how do they all interact with one another and align in different ways? So I think this is a particularly important and exciting area that we'll be needing to think about more and have continued conversations about, what this all means. We want to spend just a little bit more of your time to share some of the information that we have found from the questions that we put forward on this topic of impact. Now, impact today is, front and center and center in so many different ways, but we were curious to note that in the original version of the barometer, there was a question that asked about the top 5 challenges related to internationalization at institutions. And the respondents in that iteration of the barometer, in what they gave us, the answer assessing the relevance and measuring the impact of internationalization was not in the top 5 responses that came out of any country data set from the barometer. Today, as we'll show you, as we began to explore this question of impact with respondents, one of the key findings that came out was that nearly 50% of respondents report that they themselves are experiencing either very or significant pressure to produce evidence of impact in the work that they do. So in some fashion, we feel we can document an uptick in this notion of urgency about impact and importance. And we decided to go at this question of impact in our survey in a particular way. It would have been very tempting to ask respondents to answer the question, how is your institution making impact? But we know that that can be a difficult question for individuals to answer who may not have the fullest scope of understanding or access to data about that kind of question. So we decided to begin to unpack the impact question with the 4 questions that you see on the screen here. The first being asking respondents to tell us how they would characterize the nature of the debate or the discussion about impact. How urgent is that question at your institution or organization? How much pressure do you feel personally in your role to produce evidence of impact? Where do you see the pressure to produce evidence of impact coming from? And from where you sit, dear respondent, in which areas is your institution or organization most concerned with delivering impact from its internationalization activities? So we're going to briefly talk you through what we found from asking those particular questions. So the idea here of the debate or discussion about impact is interesting to see. We have well over 50% indicating that there is either urgent or very urgent conversation going on at institutions around this debate or discussion of impact. But indeed, close to 30% indicating that there is no urgency in regard to this conversation or no debate or discussion at all that they are aware of. So we, of course, can imagine that there are different kinds of people sitting in different places within an institution, seeing different realities. But at a macro level, this presents some interesting information for us to consider. Respondents in Northern and Western Europe were more likely to indicate that the debate is not urgent or it's non-existent, which is interesting food for thought if we think about some regional realities. Individuals holding leadership roles most often characterize debate about impact as being urgent or very urgent. And interestingly, respondents at specialized institutions seemed a little less inclined to indicate urgency around this debate or discussion. And again, we can think about what does that mean for conservatories, for business schools, for institutions that follow that particular profile specialized institution. So how much pressure do you feel in your role to produce evidence of impact? We had mentioned, that 79% feel some urgency in this role, 47% indicating urgent or very urgent, but again, 37% not feeling that same kind of urgency. And some of the, nuances or variations or wrinkles in these data include some regional perspectives, Eastern and Southern Europe respondents indicating more often most significant levels of pressure in their roles. As Jody mentioned, we had all different kinds of organizations and institutions working in international higher education responding, and respondents from NGOs most often reported very significant pressure or pressure to produce impact. We wonder if that might have something to do with the ways that NGOs are funded and what they need to evidence for the work that they want to do. And very interesting for us that individuals who identified as working principally in teaching, learning, and curriculum most often indicated feeling no pressure in their roles. So again, where we sit and what we do in our work can, of course, bring forward different kinds of perspectives. We asked, as you know, a question here about where does the evidence to produce impact or the pressure to produce evidence of impact come from? The standout groups here are institutional organizational leadership and national governments. Only 1 in 3 indicated that they saw academic staff as a source of pressure, and much less perceived were students as a source of pressure or other social actors like employers or the media. However, I think it's quite interesting that current students, for example, were most often perceived as sources of pressure by NGOs and other kinds of private providers or enterprises. Other leadership respondents, individuals who indicated they have leadership roles, more often pointed to feeling pressures from some of these other actors like students, like employers, social actors that were not so apparent as sources of pressure for other types of respondents that we had in the pool of responses. And finally, in terms of information that we gleaned about the impact dynamic amongst our respondents, we asked a question around this idea of where do you think your institution or organization is most concerned with delivering impact from its activities? We were struck by the fact that making evidence of impact in relation to institutional reputation or rankings came out as a top choice, but of course very closely followed by student learning outcomes as an area and research activities being important to be able to deliver impact in those areas. The financial health or the financial benefits of internationalization were perceived by many fewer respondents as a top 3 area where impact is, where they perceive impact as being important by their institutions, but that does differ by region. So of course, Northern Europe providing more answers that indicated that financial health is an area of concern. Professional staff and directors and managers were least likely to see demonstration of student employability as a key priority area. And respondents from research universities and specialized institutions were among the respondents that were most inclined to show that demonstrating impact by way of reputation and rankings was important, say, as compared to universities of applied sciences. So that begins to scratch the surface on that area, and we hope to do more work with regard to impact as we move forward. But to wrap up, because we don't want to overload you with any more than we have to, we thought we'd leave you with just a couple of notable findings as some final takeaways. And I'll pass this back to Jody for that.
Thank you, Laura. All right, so one of the notable findings we wanted to share is that we also included questions on budget. And one of the things we actually found there is that there were quite high levels of satisfaction linked to the size of budgets amongst those respondents with budget responsibilities. So of the respondents, 58% indicated that they have some type of budget responsibility. And of that, a rather large, over 70% of those respondents indicated that they are satisfied or very satisfied with the budget that they have. Quite a surprise, since I think many of us will recognize recognize that there's often a lot of complaining going on when it's linked to budget. So this is quite a notable finding to us. The second finding, which we already touched upon a little, is of course that everything needs attention. So we had that question where we touched upon those topics, and we saw that a lot of the topics actually received either needing more attention or needing continued levels of attention. And it is very interesting to see that there were relatively smaller percentages of respondents, especially based in Northern and Western Europe, who see the need for more or continued attention when it comes to international development and capacity building projects and local and regional community engagement and or development. So an interesting area where if we have to identify one area where we can see slightly lower levels of attention, it is actually that particular area, but then only for Northern and Western Europe. So also an interesting fact to keep in mind and think about. And last but not least, we also asked several questions focusing on the influence of particular stakeholders, and that also included national and European level authorities. These are questions that have been kind of used in the several editions of the barometer. And when we look at that data over time, we could draw a careful conclusion that some of the influence of national and European level authorities might be waning a bit. So as we can see here on the screen, while the influence of national level actors and European level actors was over 65%, this has actually decreased a bit to 58 and 53%. Obviously, we do need to take into account the visible differences between individual countries. So for example, mentioned here are Ukraine and the Netherlands. In the Ukraine, we saw, probably because of the war that has been going on there, very high levels of influence of European level actors, while for example in the Netherlands, with some of the changes happening there lately, very high influence of national authorities. So some interesting country and regional differences there as well, but on a European level, that interesting change we do see here on the screen. All right, I think I'll hand back over to Laura for one final time and to definitely tell you to put your questions in the Q&A, because we'd be very happy to answer those.
We are indeed over time, and just wanted to give you an indication that sitting on this body of data as we are developing some spin-off reports that provide a bit of a deeper dive into some of the various areas that you've heard us mentioning now. Just the other day, we've come out with our most recent on environmental sustainability and climate action, which provides indications of how respondents who indicated some knowledge or interest in that area see that work unfolding at their institution. And of course, the perceptions of impact, the national and European level influences are additional spin-off reports that we produced earlier this year, and you can be on the lookout for more to come in 2025. Our report is available if you'd like to download it, and we look forward to chatting with you about some of your impressions of what you've seen here today. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Laura and Jody, for that very thorough sort of high-speed presentation of your great barometer data. I can see the real value of doing these things over time, because it shows trends which are very interesting. And we've got some great questions in the chat, which I'll turn to, but perhaps I could start by asking you, to what extent do you think some of what your barometer findings are revealing are the changing institutional structures of the university as much as the actual internationalization context in which they're working? So if universities are becoming more strategic or sort of more intentional in their internationalization, because that's a reflection of better management or different management, then perhaps that might reflect some of the sort of responses you're getting. Because in some ways your responses are very much sort of attending to the lived work experiences, aren't they, of people working in internationalization programs.
Exactly. Yeah, I can jump in, but I would welcome, Jody's perspective as well. I think what you're saying is very valid, David. As we see that shift from having an isolation of internationalization in one particular office to a more embedded kind of cross-cutting type of activity in many different contexts. I think we also see that as in the way that institutions are working on a whole lot of different fronts, that there is that sense of we are all so familiar with the realities of siloed services and siloed activities, and have, I think, all been sensitized over the last multiple decade and more to this idea of the interconnectedness of things that we do within the university. That idea is definitely playing out in many institutions. Of course, the success of making those shifts and making that all work in practice is another question. But I do think what we are seeing is reflective of changes in management in general, in approaches to the way that responsibilities are organized in institutions, and that this is just in parallel with those types of trends. I think that's a valid assessment of what we're seeing.
Good. Okay. Well, that's really interesting, and I want to push you more on particular issues such as programs or the European University initiatives or funding sources, but perhaps we can come back to that. And I'm going to steadily unlock people so they can ask their questions. Miguel, I think you were perhaps after Philip, but Miguel, you were the first to in my line of sight to ask. Would you like to come forward? And Philip, I will then unlock you as well. Sorry, I haven't realized I have to unlock everybody. Miguel. Hi, you are muted. Sorry, I'll sort that out.
Sorry. Hi.
That's great.
Hi, Laura.
Hi, Miguel.
Hi, Laura. Hi, Jody. Sorry if I'm speaking out of turn. I did see Philip, but in any case, I'll just jump ahead. I'm sure Philip can follow.
That's fine.
Thank you. The first question is methodological. Having attended some of these conferences, the kind of EAIE, but in Asia Pacific, and very recently in Canada, the CBIE conference, and seeing the conversations among colleagues. Methodologically, I know that lots of your data refers to institutions. I was interested in kind of like these emerging hot topics and how the field is identifying those. And I was just wondering whether there's a kind of space to include as well perspectives from independent consultants. So I and some colleagues, for instance, did some work on education agents. Obviously, there are a range of individual consultants in doing different things in relation to internationalization. But I wonder if there's kind of space for them. Obviously, I know that there's only limited kind of like focus, but like, yeah, just a question and a suggestion. The other thing is there was this slide about like how internationalization affects the institution, and perhaps not surprisingly, rankings was the top item. On that slide, there was a point about learning outcomes, but I wonder whether you'd pre-identified those and then they just had to tick boxes. Sorry, I haven't read the whole report. And whether you kind of had a box there for, say, other, or do respondents raise these issues themselves? And I was wondering whether the role of the kind of point on mental health or well-being has increased, just because I think there's an increasing interest in that, perhaps in certain parts of Europe. And maybe just to add a comment that I do know from some of these practitioner conferences regarding the decentralization of this, that on an equity issue, they mentioned that some colleagues come up to them in the international office and say, oh, could you please sort this well-being or counseling issue for this international student? And they felt that this was deeply inequitable, as if that this wasn't an issue for all students, and that somehow international students needed to be treated in a different way, or that their mental health was a kind of specific animal compared to all other students.
Miguel, that was such great questions, and it's great to have your perspective on these conferences. Sorry, Laura and Jody, you could probably talk for 20 minutes on all that, but just see how you get on. Thank you, Miguel.
There's some quick things that we can answer, then I'll, Jody, if I miss anything. In terms of perspectives of educational agents and providers, or those not connected to institutions, the survey was open to individuals who had those types of profiles, Miguel. It just turned out that we did not get tons and tons of answers from them. We can actually go back into the data and isolate them and potentially find something there. But because the numbers are relatively small, it probably isn't going to be too illuminating. But over time, we really are keen, I think, to make sure that the survey, which could grow exponentially in the numbers of respondents, that is for sure. We're very proud of nearly hitting 3,000, but it's a drop in the bucket, compared to what really we would love to have. But there is information from those individuals, and we very much see them as part of this community. And we don't want to continue making sure that their voices and perspectives are included in the data that we collect. When it comes to the impact question, we did some preliminary development of a list of responses that individuals could choose from. This was the question, from your perspective, what are the top 3 areas in which you perceive your institution or organization is interested in delivering impact? I need the question in front of me. But this question was one that we developed in consultation with an advisory board. We put it through a pilot test. We wanted to make sure that the range of answers, felt comfortable enough to people. And then we did have an other option at the bottom if they did not see their answer available. And relatively few individuals opted for sharing anything more in that other box. So indeed, trying to open the door on that, but it didn't really lead to a whole lot of other input, in terms of those questions. The last thing on the student well-being, to say anecdotally, very much the same experience I have had, where individuals have said to me that in their roles in international offices, they have typically been approached or received phone calls to say, your student needs this kind of assistance, and the response being, this is our student. These are our issues, and there are plenty of ways that there are shared interests and needs across the student body. So indeed, also trying to make sure that we are being attentive to the way that we also structure questions, and positioning them in a larger context, of course, is extremely important. I don't know, Jody, if there's anything more that you wanted to follow up on there.
I think the only thing I'd add here, also seeing some of the other comments in the chat on well-being, is that we actually had another question at the end of the survey, which asked respondents to indicate which topic had particular professional or personal interest to them, and they could choose from a list of topics that we identified based on other research that we did. And student and staff well-being actually was chosen most often by 37% of our respondents as the most important topic at this moment in time. So I think that does indeed kind of match some of the things I've seen in the chat here, and that it is a topic that is on a lot of people's minds at this moment in time and demands quite a bit of attention.
Great, thanks, Miguel. That's really interesting, and thank you, Jody and Laura. Philip, you actually did ask a question first. I didn't see that, and then you came back again with another question as well, which was sort of going beyond the data. Do you want to come in and ask those? You're currently on mute. You can unmute yourself. So perhaps if Philip, you can't do that, then we could just get you to, I can read the questions out, and Jody and Laura, you can respond. So Philip, first point was, is it interesting that people seem broadly satisfied? You've got most people satisfied despite these growing pressures to produce evidence of what they were doing and achieving. There's a slight contradiction there, but perhaps that's just a reflection of somehow the rewards of doing well, and then the larger question is Philip asks about the bigger issues facing Europe, such as populism, and do those sorts of things come up ever in your survey, and do people sort of obviously your questions probably are limited to more institutional focus, but do you ever get glimpses of those sorts of issues coming up?
So I'll jump in here, and Jody, join me. So we actually were struck by the incredibly upbeat nature of the responses. There really is something about the starting point that people seem to bring to this work, which is that sense of really believing in it, feeling that this work has purpose that seems to kind of trump everything else. And indeed, the budget question in particular, we were really struck by that and have work to do to analyze more about by country, by role, et cetera, what's going on there as an example, of something that was also surprising. The data were collected from September to December 2023. So I think that as we come back to these questions in the next go-round, which we hope to do in these 3-year intervals, I would suspect that we will see more negative responses for sure across a bunch of these different areas. I was very struck by the fact that there was not a lot of strong indication of the geopolitical pressures, and indeed the positive feeling coming out of a place like Ukraine was almost the opposite of what you would expect, that the sense of it's so much more important that our work move forward, that we're so happy about what we're able to achieve with what we've got anyway. So I think really that is going to be, I think that will be changing over time. I think it's going to drip down much more clearly to kind of operational levels. People may be shielded or were shielded from that a bit a year ago, and that will change. So that's a personal perspective. I think there was a question in the Q&A about this idea of trends in answers over time from respondents in countries that are in particularly pressured situations. And we could, in fact, take that on board and try and go back and do a little analysis there to see if there's a story to be told along the lines of what I'm saying.
Is it hard for you to change the questions in some ways because of the purpose of the longitudinal, such that if things do become seemingly more important, yet the barometer you don't want to keep changing questions, otherwise you can't follow things through longitudinally?
No, but we do feel very strongly that the results need to be valuable today and to hang on to questions that were important 10 years ago when the field was in a particular way, at a particular stage. It doesn't make sense if we're really trying to get at the real story today. So we are careful and we're trying to hang on to a few core ideas that we can carry through. But I think we really see the barometer as being quite important to be relevant to the moment. And that's important to us.
Great. Okay, so some people are using the Q&A, which is great, and some people are using the chat. So I'm going to turn to the Q&A now. I'm going to ask Lee Rensimer first, and then Rachel. Lee. Hi, welcome.
Okay, hello. Hi, Laura. Hi, Jody. Thank you both. It's nice to have a nice, richly empirical presentation, lots of data points to think about and ways you can cross them. And that's what had me thinking with just these two questions I've posed. The first one you've already covered, and I'll look forward to the next round of data collections. We can kind of dig deeper into those questions of domestic political pressures a little further. But I guess the second question I was going to ask was also about whether you could discern any trends in relation to the roles and remits that your participants held, and if there's ways that you could tease them apart. I was thinking particularly about T&E versus internationalization at home, and whether they had different sentiments about the prospects of T&E, their sense particularly about the perceptions of impact, and whether those who engage in T&E have a very different view to what they feel their work is doing versus those who internationalize at home.
I think, Lee, thank you so much for those questions. Very interesting indeed. And I think if it was up to Laura and me, we would probably add 100 different types of things that we could do to kind of segment these different responses. I fully indeed appreciate the kind of the segmentation you're mentioning there. We didn't kind of put in a particular factor that could overlook T&E or internationalization at home. So we wouldn't be able at this time around to do that. We had to make particular decisions on where we could indeed have particular answer segments and different respondents into different groups. But this is very interesting to take on board and to especially take into consideration. I think T&E is something that especially related to the UK, but also is growing more and more and becoming more important within the field, taking on a different role. And that will be very nice to kind of see those developments as well within the data that we collect.
To follow up on that, though, also to say that we are able to see, based on years of experience, different kinds of particular roles, holding leadership roles, holding more sort of specialist or coordinator roles, manager roles, that type of thing. So those kinds of segmentation we can and have poked around in quite a bit. And it is, I think, interesting to see, principally, as I think we mentioned in one of the slides, the tendency for there to be some different answers perceived by other leadership or leadership role holders as opposed to others. But then in quite a number of areas, a lot of continuity across the roles and shared perceptions. So that was rather interesting as well. But yeah, to Jody's point, TNA in particular, not an area that we can isolate this time around, but maybe something that we can think of to think of that dichotomy in the data for next time.
Great, thanks, Lee. That's really interesting. Thanks, Laura and Jody. Rachel.
Hi there, thanks David, and thanks Laura and Jody for your presentation. Yeah, I had, I suppose, a question about national differences, because right at the end, Laura, you did sort of talk about some particular countries, but I suppose prior to that, you've been talking about kind of differences between regions in Europe. And I just wondered, when you're looking at national differences, was that the kind of main difference, or were there differences by country in terms of, I don't know, size of international student flow, degree of marketisation, level of tuition fees, which I guess in the literature are all kind of argued to have a impact on processes of internationalization?
Yeah, that's a super interesting set of questions. I think the differences or the ways that you're thinking about the differences may be inferred from some of the findings that we have come up with. So, for example, that finding about the focus on financial health as being something that was a response that was chosen by individuals more often in Western and Northern Europe than in Southern and Eastern Europe. That we could probably apply a variety of different lenses that would help us understand that and explain that kind of difference across the regions. But indeed, we did not. We asked people to give us some information about the size of their institutions, both in terms of just general enrollment, but also the flows of students inbound or outbound, international, et cetera, to give us a little bit of a sense of those dynamics. But haven't really thought about, or in the questions that we asked, to have people identify, degrees of marketization or that type of thing. That's sort of an analysis we would have to overlay on the data ourselves. And indeed, we have not done, as you've seen, the spin-off reports have been focused on several different types of topics. I think that idea of the types of countries and flows could be something that we could also consider for a future spin-off. But we're really taking it sort of a step at a time with these various topics.
Thank you, thanks.
Sorry, thank you, Rachel. One final, perhaps question, perhaps an impossible one. Kathy, you asked in the chat about expanding to include students, which is, do you want to expand a bit, Kathy?
Thank you, David. I think you have started to cover this, and you mentioned that institutions saw the students as theirs, and in a sense one would assume that the institutions themselves are investigating their students' well-being and taking responsibility for that. I did just think, that the kind of discourse around internationalization, if you take a step back, you don't really hear student voice, student agency, students' role in self-transformation, other things that I've picked up in these seminars. And it may just be a kind of practical issue, which you, I think, have intimated. But I did wonder, I would have thought students are really important, and their well-being can only be addressed if the student voice is a bit stronger. I don't know if you have further thoughts on that. Thank you.
I think, Kathy, we definitely fully agree with that statement that indeed the student voice is incredibly important. I think for us it mainly has to do with the association that we work for, who represents professionals working within international higher education, and that is the decision made for us to focus on that field. However, that being said, we are, for example, collaborating with the Erasmus Student Network, who have recently published their report based on their survey amongst international students who have undergone an Erasmus Plus experience. And we are actually in talks with them to kind of explore, could we perhaps do a comparison of barometer data and student data, kind of comparing how do professionals within the field feel about a particular topic, and how does that correspond with data from the students, to actually kind of have that nice correlation there between those two. So we are definitely kind of open to exploring that, but I think when looking at the scope of our survey, which already resulted in so much interesting data, if we would add students to that, I think we'd be in for the long haul when analyzing all of that. But thank you. I do agree. It's a very important voice that needs to be heard.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Kathy, and good to push on that. And I think you're absolutely right that if you can link it to other forms of data, that is a sort of the best probably you can do. So this has been great. Thank you very much, Jody and Laura. You're giving us a glimpse of working conditions in internationalisation, and a huge data set to keep pushing at and finding out more from. Next week, we are going to be thinking again about the European higher education area in relationship to what's happening in Ukraine and how the area is becoming more internationalized and more strategic in some ways as a response. Thank you all for coming as normal. We will record with our recording. We'll go up on our website tomorrow. I'm sure that Jody and Laura will be happy to answer questions if you have any about this data set. And of course, the report is on their website for you to have a look at. Thanks all, everyone. See you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye.